Hey everyone, it's Mark here. In this video, I'm going to go over this Panerai Luminor PAM244 GMT, which is a limited edition of 800 units. It's a 40mm Panerai Luminor, so it is on the small side for a Panerai. I'll go over my thoughts about the watch, my thoughts about the movement, the finish quality, and the aesthetics, and whether it's a watch you might consider purchasing. And I'll also compare it to some other watches, in general other Panerais, but also other GMTs or dual times, such as the Mont Blanc dual time that I have. And in short, I think it's a watch that you would definitely want to shortlist purchasing. It's at a price point that is very competitive for GMT complications. Furthermore, to my mind, it is the best size Panerai one can buy. In short, it is smaller than most of the gargantuan Panerais that are out there at 44 or 47mm, which are too large unless you have a wrist the size of the Hulk. And to my mind, 40mm, which is what this watch is absolutely perfect for this type of watch. And when you compress everything into that smaller case size, the Panerai dial starts to gain more textural integrity and coherence by virtue of being smaller and pushed in, and it starts to look less inelegant than some of the larger Panerais can appear. It's also, like I said, a limited edition of 800 units, for whatever that means. But of course, when everything is limited edition, nothing ultimately is, so to some extent the limited editionness of it is nice to have, but I would not necessarily say that's a reason to absolutely go out and purchase the watch. Rather, it's just a nice to have thing in addition. And in short, the movement is perfectly nice, it's competent, it works well, it has some nice features such as anti-shock and anti-expansion. The case finish is very competent, everything looks very nice in it, and I think it's the perfect size. So like I said, I'd shortlist it. But if you have any views about the watch, if you think I'm totally off base, if you think I'm wrong about Panerai case sizes, or if you just think I'm completely clueless, let me know that in the comments below. And otherwise, of course, it would be great if you like the video and subscribe to the channel. And let's start with our review, and we'll start off with the movement. It's a Panerai automatic movement with 21 joules. It has 28,800 alternations per hour. So this manifests in a reasonably smooth second hand in the small seconds dial here. Of course, given the size, it is always going to look slightly smoother than a large seconds hand. Now in terms of complications, it has a GMT complication and it has a date complication. Now this is reasonably good value given that this is a useful complication that doesn't really add terribly much to the price. So we can now look at some of the additional features. So for example, it has Inca block shock protection that effectively purports to protect this against drops and falls and the damage therefrom. Furthermore, it has, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, glycador balance. Now what that effectively means is the balance is protected against increases in size due to heat. So as heat occurs, metals in the watch or any other metals will expand. If it has some protection against this, i.e. due to the materials being used, that helps to prevent wear and tear. Of course, if the metals expand and the space between metals decreases, then you're going to get more friction and more wear and tear. So the glycador balance then helps to mitigate some of that. So that is a nice to have feature as well, i.e. some additional protection against damage due to hot temperatures and or due to falls with that Inca block, with the Inca block anti-shock protection. To get access to these, we obviously need to open up the crown. To do this, we need to use this little lever here. A way to tell fake or really bad fake Panerais from genuine ones is this lever should be perpendicular to the case when you open it up. Most decent fakes are probably going to do this, but still really bad ones, this is going to flop around at weird angles. Alright, so we now need to get the crown out. It effectively has two levels, and I'm going to use a travel card right here. Of course, it is really annoying to adjust crowns in my experience. So what we have here at the outermost setting is we can adjust the minute hand. Now you'll notice when we adjust the minute hand, both the hour hand and the GMT hand also move at the same time. So that is both good and bad. Everything adjusts at the same time, but still a little bit annoying if you just want to adjust one of them. Now, what we can do is we can move the crown in just a little bit. If we move it in just a little bit, we'll start to be able to adjust the date. Now, if I scroll it upwards, I can adjust the date, and it adjusts very smoothly. The date ends up being centered in here when I move it, and that is always, well, a good sign, at least a passable sign. It's always a little bit disquieting when the date doesn't actually log in properly. Now, if I adjust it downwards, what you'll notice here is I can move the GMT hand and move it by set increments. That can be useful if you have time zones that are not neat increments of one another and/or one needs to adjust the time zone. I.e., a GMT complication is kind of annoying without either a bezel that you can alter here, or the ability to adjust the GMT hand to adjust for different time zones, which is what I am doing at the moment, unsurprisingly. One would then obviously be able to adjust this in between by adjusting this minute hand. So that would enable you to adjust which time zones you are ultimately keeping track of. So that's effectively how our GMT complication is working. Now, I'm not a massive fan of these, in part because sometimes you get some time zone differences that are like half an hour different from one another, which can be a little bit finicky and annoying to deal with in a complication like this. So GMT complications are, to my mind, somewhat limited in their applicability. Nevertheless, they are a nice complication to have, even though there are obviously some application limits to it. Now, one thing I should probably mention is, if we pull this crown all the way out to its furthermost setting, i.e. the one where we can adjust the minute hand, here what you'll notice is, if I actually get it all the way out, the second hand will stop, so it obviously has hacking, which I guess is a plus side here. And here again we can adjust our minute hand. So let's put the crown all the way back in and continue on with the watch. Overall, complications though are easy to use, easy enough to access, and the crown moves reasonably smoothly, so it's as good as you're going to get within this type of segment of watch. So what about the case and the finishing and the quality? Well, Panerai over time has been hit and miss in this respect. Sometimes their watches have had issues in terms of finishing. However, I would regard this watch as being finished in a perfectly competent manner. So the case here, it's a cushion-shaped case, as you can tell obviously, and it's made out of steel, which is not terribly surprising given that would describe most Panerai watches. Now, the steel that they use is supposed to be corrosion resistant, and is supposed to be low carbon steel, which they assert is particularly appropriate for dive watches and watches that might be exposed to a high corrosion environment. Now, I'll take their word for it here. I am not going to be putting this into salt water anytime soon, so I am not going to be testing its corrosion resistance. However, it appears that that's a nice-to-have feature. Now, in terms of more day-to-day and mundane things, the finish quality is obviously quite good. So if we just zoom around the watch here, what you'll notice is that there are no particularly obvious tool marks. There are some issues like just some dirt and the like that has arisen because it's a used watch, but what you'll notice is there is no clear tool marks. This is also across all of the case here. The finish is done in a reasonably sophisticated manner. You can tell this if we just zoom in. All of the edges line up perfectly well. Everything looks like it should. Now, you can get some really high quality replicas these days, but oftentimes you can just tell the difference between a replica and an original watch through the finish quality. So if we look through the watch here, everything is reasonably high finish quality. On the back of the case, you'll see that there's textures here, or textured print, sorry, and on this back here, you'll notice as well just some lettering. It's not an open back case, there isn't a design here, but there is lettering. It looks perfectly fine, so I don't really have anything particularly unusual to say about that. And Panerai has had some pretty cases in the past, but they haven't always been associated with particularly good watches or finish quality, i.e. the Brooklyn Bridge edition. So overall, the finish quality on this is very nice in terms of the case. In terms of the dial, also finish quality is nice. So Panerai dials are, I guess, love it or loathe it. Basically, some Panerai dials look very nice, and I think it depends a little bit on the model as to how it works. So in this one, the 40mm, I think the Panerai dial works incredibly well. I think on this smaller watch, everything works together in a coherent manner. I think on the larger watches, when everything is spaced out, so 44mm or 47mm, everything looks a little bit inelegant. When everything is pushed together here, everything is compressed. It is still legible because it's 40mm, but it looks like everything works together in harmony, which contrasts with the larger models where I think everything is spaced out too much. In short, I think this is the perfect case size for a Panerai watch because it forces everything to work together in a coherent manner, as opposed to in the larger watches. Now, if we look at the actual dial itself, you'll notice, which is unsurprising for a watch in this price point, that everything is finished competently. Everything is done in a way that is, I guess, reasonably refined. Everything is uniform. There are no clear blemishes or spots or whatever around the dial here. You'll notice as well that this small seconds hand here is just recessed a little bit with that smaller dial. So I'd say that the finish quality on the dial is good. In terms of the actual dial material, again, that is Panerai. Basically, if you're going to buy a Panerai, you get a dial like this. I personally prefer some of the Rolex dials. I personally am not a massive fan of this black dial, but again, that's what Panerai watches are. So you can't really complain about what the dial is when that's what the dial is with all of these watches. Now, I think they can maybe improve it a little bit, maybe slightly change the material the black is from, and I think that could elevate the dial. But I also know that this is cheaper than the Rolex GMT Master, so I mean, you have to basically factor in the price points as well. But I think they could make the dial a little bit nicer without losing the inherent character of it, is in short what I'm trying to say here. So otherwise, I'd say the finish quality is extremely nice. I think it looks elegant enough. I have no negative things to say about this watch. I would have more negatives to say about larger Panerais in terms of aesthetics than I would about this particular one. So how does the watch look on the wrist? Well, here, like I said, 40mm, and my wrist is probably between 7 and 7.5 inches, depending on how much I've eaten that day, to be completely honest. So my wrist will sometimes bloat up if I've eaten too much. So in any case, it works quite well on my wrist. I don't think I would want anything larger for my wrist here. If you have a Hulk-like wrist, or if you're a bodybuilder, you would want to go for a larger watch. But if you are not, and if you're a normal person, then 40mm is perfectly fine. So how does the lume work? Because if this is supposed to be a functional watch or a dive watch, you kind of want functional lume as well. So, kind of trying to cover up the light here, what you'll notice is we have this bluish-green lume finish to it, which I think works really well. I like the color tone that it has. It definitely pops. It shows up basically immediately. So I think the lume is perfectly functional. You can see everything you need to see when you've got everything darkened. The lume is obviously on all of the indicators for the hours. It's obviously on all of the hands and enables you to see what second work is going on here as well. So it basically enables you to see what the watch is doing when everything is darkened out. So I think the lume works perfectly well. Nothing to complain about there. I'm not sure I'd say it's especially unusual lume-wise, but certainly it functions. And I think the attention to detail in respect of it is perfectly fine, because you don't see any errors in the lume. I see no blotchy bits. You don't see any lumps or anything like that. Everything is consistent. Everything is uniform, and the lume functions as you would want it to function. What are my overall thoughts? Would you avoid this watch? Would you buy this watch? Would you shortlist this watch? Well, in short, I'd put this at the top of my shortlist list. I'm not sure I'd necessarily go out and buy it at the first shot. However, it's definitely one of the better GMT movements out there. You compare this price-wise to, say, for example, a Mont Blanc Dual Time, and this looks pretty competitive, if I'm totally honest. Now, GMT and Dual Time complications are, for all practical purposes, pretty similar. So I wouldn't necessarily be choosing one complication over the other. And I think this price point-wise is pretty competitive now, if we're comparing the two. Furthermore, I think this is the perfect size for a Panerai. I think 40mm is absolutely what I would want if I were to buy this. I wouldn't go any larger. So in terms of the models that Panerai puts out, this would absolutely be at the top of my list. This size is absolutely perfect for me. So this, for me, if I were looking in the Panerai market, would be the precise Panerai I would buy over all of the other ones. Of course, if you have a larger wrist, your views might change, and that might change its ranking in your shortlist. It's also cheaper than the Rolex GMT Master 2 or Rolex GMT Master, so as a result, it's a little bit more affordable for this type of complication, and it's more affordable even though it comes from a brand with very good recognition as well. So in short, I'd put this at the top of my shortlist. I'm not sure I'd necessarily automatically buy it per se at first glance. I'd consider my other options, but I'd regard this as a perfectly competitive GMT, given the movement in question, given the qualities that it is made from, and given the aesthetics of it, and given that this is, to my mind, the best Panerai size and shape that one can obtain. So in short, I'd put it toward the top of my shortlist, but I would not necessarily say it's a must-have purchase, to be completely clear here. Now, if you have any views about this watch, if you think I've missed anything, if you think I'm totally wrong, let me know in the comments below. I'm sure that you think that I'm totally off base, you'll let me know and flame me for it anyway. But otherwise, it would be brilliant if you like the video and subscribe to the channel, and hope to see you for future videos as well. Bye.